Today we are going to learn how to create a custom React hook that allows us to easily fetch data reactively. We're also going to take this one step further by adding TypeScript generics to the hook, making it applicable across all your app. This is an exciting one, so let's dive in. To get started, first we'll create our project by using npx create next app --ts. And as always, I am using Next.js and TypeScript in my project. And you don't have to use Next, however, for the project because I'm easily creating an API that I want to call. Next is a good choice for that. And then TypeScript can be used for the first part of the lesson. However, the second part where we add generics, you do need TypeScript to be able to do this. Once create next app is finished, we can go ahead in our index file and delete all of the contents in there. To begin, we're going to navigate to the pages and API directory, and you'll see there is a hello.ts file in there. If you're unfamiliar with Next.js, Next.js allows you to create an Express-based API inside of your app. We're going to use this feature to create the API that our custom hook will call. To do this, we are going to rename the file from hello.ts to user.ts. And now I'm not going to spend too much time on the creation of our REST API, but basically we're having a simple GET request where if there's a query ID that's equal to 1, we're going to return a simple John Doe user. And if it's not, they're going to return a 403 unknown user error. And now inside of our React app, we want to be able to call this endpoint reactively in our index.ts file. To do this, I'm going to create another directory called lib in the root directory and add the file getuserrequest.ts. This is our custom hook file that we will use to query our user endpoint. Now our function we're going to call getUserRequest, and it's going to take in an ID as a parameter, and it will be returning a user or undefined, an error or undefined, and a Boolean loading indicator. We have to add a user type, so we're going to create another directory called types, and in it we'll put user.ts, and user will just contain a name and an email string. As this is a React hook, we can use React's useState to create the variables that we will need in this request. These three useState variables are user and setUser, error and setError, and loading and setLoading. And you will see we are also returning these at the very bottom. But now we need to actually fetch the data, so we are going to use useEffect hook for that. You'll see I'm also including ID as the dependency of useEffect because if ID ever changes in our component, then we want to refetch the user and then update the results. We're going to use fetch to get the HTTP results from our server. Now you can use Axios or whatever you use, but for simplicity we're just going to use fetch in this example. We'll pass in our URL, which is the localhost 3000/API/user, and then we'll set ID as a query parameter. Because fetch returns a promise, we can then add a .then statement, which has result as the parameter. And first we are going to get the JSON from the request. Once we have the JSON, we can check if the result is okay or if there was an error code. And if it is, we are going to create the user object and then set user to that object. If the request had a non-okay response code, so in our example a 403 response code, we are setting the error to json.error. Then outside of that then statement, we'll add a catch statement, and in case of a network error, we're setting error to E. And now lastly, we add a finally statement, and inside of finally, we set the loading to false. Now as an overview of this function, basically what's happening is we have our use states above, and then our useEffect is running once the hook is done, and we can't just include this code in the base of the function because let's say the window resizes or something that causes the hook to run again, it'll keep on running that request. So useEffect helps prevent that. And then we are then returning the user, error, and loading. And these values will update reactively as our useState values update. So our components will always have the latest data. Now to use this hook, we can go back to our index.tsx file, and we will create the three variables user, error, loading, and set that to getUserRequest, and we'll pass in an ID of 1. And inside of our return statement, we're just going to return a simple h1 tag that says user, and then we will check if there's an error, and if there is, we'll return the error. Otherwise, we'll check if it's loading, and if it is loading, then we'll return text loading. Otherwise, we are returning the user.name. Now, if we run this code in our browser, you will see that it'll load for about 2 seconds, and then the username will pop up, John Doe. And if we go back to our code and change get user request to 2, and then run in our browser, you'll see that after the loading indicator, unknown user is shown in place of the John Doe username. Now this method works great for single requests. However, if you're creating multiple requests, which in a real application you will be, we need something a little more versatile to use. To do this, we're going to create another React hook, but this one will be called getRequest. So back in our lib folder, we're going to create a new file called getRequest.ts. And to start, we're just going to copy over all of our code from the get user request into our getRequest file. Now what this hook is doing is it is one hook to get any requests. Let's say we want to get user or comments or articles. This hook will allow us to do that in one hook instead of creating multiple hooks such as get user request, get comment request, get article request, and etc. To help us implement this, we're going to use TypeScript's generic feature. So in the getRequest method declaration, we are going to add a t variable before our URL input. And then we can change our return type from user and user to a result of type t or undefined. And then down below, where we have our useState user, we can change the name user to result and set result. And we'll change the useState to be of type t. And now lastly, down below in our useEffect area, where we're setting result to the JSON, we're setting result to user, but it should be to type t. Another cool thing we can do is if we know we're constantly fetching results from the same URL, in our example localhost 3000/API, we can just include that in the fetch and then pass in the URL as the string instead of our components always having to pass that whole URL in there. Lastly, make sure you're returning result instead of user at the very bottom. And then we can change the dependency of useEffect to URL instead of ID. Now let's use this hook inside of our index.tsx file. To do this, we are going to go back to our index.tsx file and get result, error, and loading from getRequest instead of getUserRequest. And then we're going to add in the generic type user. And for our URL, we're going to do /user $ID equals 1. Then we have to change our code in the return statement to use result instead of user. Now if we run this code in the browser, everything should change the same. And if we were to say ID is equal to 3, then we should get the unknown user as well. So this hook functions exactly like getUserRequest. However, now we can use this hook for other resources that we are fetching as well. Now it is worth noting that other libraries do this for us, such as use SWR. However, I don't think there's a purpose to importing a big library if we can achieve the same functionality in a single small file in TypeScript. So there you have it, a simple React hook that allows you to easily make requests much faster than if you were to do it inside of a component. And it helps with dealing with errors and loading indicators, as you can now just check if it's loading, and then if so, return your loading indicator. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a thumbs up and subscribing, as I will be posting more videos like this in the future. Thank you.